In the frozen dawn of January 15th, 1943, as the ghetto of Warsaw lay buried beneath drifts of gray snow, Mordecai Goldstein adjusted his cap bearing the hated Blue Star of David and gripped his wooden truncheon. At 32 years of age, with hollow cheeks that had once been full and eyes that had witnessed horrors no human should endure, he stepped into the alley where a child of perhaps 9 years was attempting to smuggle a loaf of bread through a hole in the ghetto wall. The Jewish policeman's breath formed clouds in the bitter air as his trembling hands closed around the boy's collar, knowing that showing mercy meant death for them both, yet knowing equally that following orders meant something worse than death, the surrender of his soul. The wooden truncheon hung at his side, heavier than any weapon carried by men in the darkest corners of Europe's war, as neighbors watched from shadowed windows, their judgment falling like the coldest snow Warsaw had seen in 50 years. This is the story of how hunger transformed ordinary men into both victims and perpetrators, guardians and betrayers. Subscribe now to discover what happened when the most brutal winter of the war forced impossible choices that would echo across generations. The macabre story of ghetto police, hunger that walked the streets. Mordecai Goldstein had never imagined himself becoming the thing he most despised. Before the war, he had been a mathematics teacher at a respected gymnasium in Warsaw, known for his patience with struggling students and his collection of fine fountain pens that he used to grade papers in different colors of ink. His wife, Hester, had teased him about the ink stains that perpetually marked his fingers, calling them the badges of his profession. In 1943, the only badge that mattered was the blue armband marking him as Jüdischer Ordnungsdienst, Jewish Order Service, the ghetto police that served as the lowest instrument of Nazi control over the condemned population of the Warsaw Ghetto. The morning air bit through his threadbare coat as he conducted his patrol along Gęzia Street. The coat had once belonged to a banker who had died of typhus in the second winter of the ghetto's existence. Mordecai had traded 3 days' bread rations for it, a transaction that had seemed sensible at the time, but now haunted him with each pang of hunger that twisted his stomach. 3 years into the war, hunger was no longer merely a sensation, but an entity that walked alongside every ghetto resident, a companion more faithful than any friend, more demanding than any German officer. The street was beginning to awaken as he walked. Skeletal figures emerged from crowded buildings where 10 or 12 people shared spaces meant for 3. They moved with the careful conservation of energy that marked ghetto survivors. No step wasted, no gesture without purpose. Mordecai nodded at some, received blank stares in return from most. As a Jewish policeman, he existed in the liminal space between victim and collaborator, neither fully accepted by his own people nor respected by the Germans, who used him as a tool of control. "Officer Goldstein," a voice called from a doorway. Rebecca Zimmerman stood there, once plump and cheerful, now a collection of sharp angles beneath her faded dress. She had been a neighbor in the time before, her son Daniel, a promising student in Mordecai's mathematics class. "Have you seen Daniel this morning? He went out before dawn to stand in the bread line." Mordecai felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the January temperature. Disappearances in the ghetto rarely ended well. "Which distribution point?" "On Miwa Street," she said, her hands working nervously at the frayed edges of her shawl. "He should have returned 2 hours ago." "I will look," Mordecai promised, though they both knew what such promises were worth in the ghetto. Nonetheless, he redirected his patrol toward Miwa Street, passing the former bank building where German administrative offices now operated. A cluster of SS officers stood smoking outside, their breath and cigarette smoke mingling in the frigid air. Mordecai kept his eyes down as he passed, the gesture of subservience now as natural to him as breathing. The bread distribution point on Miwa Street had long since closed. The crowds dispersed, a few desperate figures still lingering in hopes of finding crumbs dropped in the snow. No sign of Daniel Zimmerman. Mordecai questioned the lingerers, but received only shrugs and hollow-eyed stares in response. He was about to leave when he noticed a trail of dark droplets in the snow leading into an alley between buildings. Blood. Not unusual in the ghetto where violence, from Germans, from Jewish police, from desperate residents fighting over scraps, had become commonplace. But something about the regularity of the droplets, like a trail of breadcrumbs in a fairy tale that had twisted into nightmare, compelled him to follow. The alley narrowed, the buildings leaning toward each other as if sharing whispered secrets. The blood trail continued, fresher now. Mordecai fingered his truncheon, a useless gesture of preparation against whatever horror waited ahead. The alley opened into a small courtyard, one of the many hidden spaces in the ghetto where private tragedies unfolded beyond official notice. Daniel Zimmerman lay crumpled against a wall, his thin jacket pulled open, a gash across his forehead. Beside him, clutching a blood-stained loaf of bread, stood Isaac Bromberg, another of Mordecai's former students, now 16, and with the feral look of a ghetto survivor in his eyes. "Officer," Isaac said, neither fleeing nor relinquishing his grip on the bread. "He is not dead. I did not kill him." Mordecai knelt beside Daniel, feeling for a pulse at the boy's neck. Present, but weak. "What happened here, Isaac?" "He had bread," Isaac said simply, as if this explained everything. In the ghetto, perhaps it did. More than his share. He must have traded something valuable. I asked him to share. He refused. "So you took it by force." "I'm sorry it came to blows," Isaac said, though his grip on the bread did not loosen. "But my sisters have not eaten in 2 days. Our rations were stolen yesterday." A pause, then with defiance. "What will you do, Officer Goldstein? Turn me over to the Germans for stealing Jewish bread? Beat me yourself. Take the bread as a bribe to look the other way?" The questions hung between them like the cloud of their visible breath in the cold air. All were scenarios Mordecai had witnessed among the Jewish police, some taking bribes to overlook infractions, others enforcing ghetto regulations with unnecessary zeal to prove their usefulness to German overlords, a few using their position to settle old scores or accumulate petty power. "Help me carry him home," Mordecai said finally. "Then we will divide the bread. 1/3 for Daniel's family, 1/3 for yours, 1/3 for the Mendel children who lost both parents last week." Isaac's face registered surprise, then suspicion. "And what do you take, officer?" "Nothing today," Mordecai said. The hunger in his belly protested, but he silenced it with practiced discipline. "Today I am still a teacher, making sure his students survive another day." Together, they carried Daniel through the snaking alleyways, avoiding the main streets where German patrols or other Jewish police might see them and ask uncomfortable questions. Rebecca Zimmerman's cry upon seeing her bloodied son nearly undid Mordecai's composure, but he maintained the professional distance that had become his shield. "He was attacked for his bread ration," Mordecai explained, omitting Isaac's name as the assailant. "He needs rest and warmth. I have arranged for you to receive a portion of the bread he was carrying." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Arranged with whom? The attacker? Did you catch him?" "Justice in the ghettos is complicated," Mordecai said, the words tasting bitter. "Food has been arranged. That is what matters now." She accepted this with the resignation of one who had learned that survival sometimes required setting aside questions of justice. As he left the Zimmerman apartment, Mordecai caught Isaac by the arm. "I was not lying about dividing the bread 3 ways, he said quietly. "The Mendel children are at Building 16 on Noalipi Street. Take their portion there before you go home." "Why not just let me keep 2/3? Isaac challenged. "You would never know." "I would know," Mordecai said. "And so would you. We have lost enough without losing ourselves completely." Isaac's defiance faltered. For a moment, Mordecai glimpsed the boy who had once solved complex equations at the blackboard, eager for approval. "Yes, teacher," he said, then disappeared down an alleyway with the promised portions of bread. Mordecai continued his patrol, the encounter settling into the part of his mind where he stored the daily compromises and small resistances that defined life in the ghetto. By midday, he had helped break up a fight at another distribution point, turned away from seeing a child squeezed through a gap in the wall to the area inside, and assisted an elderly man who had collapsed in the street, likely from hunger, though in the ghetto, causes of suffering blended together until individual sources became indistinguishable. As he walked, Mordecai's thoughts returned to the path that had led him to become Jüdischer Ordnungsdienst. In May 1941, after more than a year of ghetto life had whittled away his former existence, the order had come for men between 28 and 35 to report for evaluation as potential ghetto police. Those who did not report voluntarily would be selected anyway, with consequences for resistance. The Jewish Council, the Judenrat, had emphasized that having Jews police Jews was preferable to increased German presence within the ghetto. "Better our own people decide how to implement German orders," Council Chairman Lichtenbaum had said during the recruitment. "We can cushion the blows if we control their delivery." Some had volunteered out of genuine belief that they could protect their community by serving as buffers between German demands and Jewish implementation. Others saw opportunity. Ghetto police received extra rations, better housing, and a degree of protection for their families. Mordecai had reported because the mathematics of survival indicated it was his best option to keep Esther alive. For a time, the rationalization had been enough. He had enforced curfews but warned neighbors in advance of German inspections. He had conducted census counts but helped certain families hide excess members to reduce deportation risks. He had confiscated contraband but returned food items when German eyes were elsewhere. Then had come the first action, in July 1942. The German word sounded almost gentle, action or operation, but it had meant the selection of thousands of ghetto residents for deportation to what they now knew was almost certain death at Treblinka. The Jewish police had been ordered to fill quotas to help round up their own people. Some refused and were shot immediately. Others fled their posts and went into hiding with their families, though few had remained hidden for long. Mordecai had reported for duty, telling himself he would find ways to warn people, to help some escape, to select those already near death rather than children and young parents. Esther had not spoken to him for 3 days afterward. "You have become one of them," she had finally said on the 4th day, her voice flat. "I have become what I need to be to keep us alive," he had responded. She had looked at him with eyes that had once held love and now held something closer to pity. "But at what cost, Mordecai? If we survive this way, what will be left of us?" It was a question he had no answer for then, and less of one now, 6 months later, with Esther, 3 months in her grave after typhus had taken her, despite the extra rations his position had secured. Her death had left him hollow, functioning on instinct and habit, his moral calculations reduced to moment-by-moment decisions between terrible options. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the narrow ghetto streets, Mordecai headed toward the building that served as headquarters for his precinct of the Jewish police. The structure had once been a school, its classrooms now converted to administrative offices and holding cells. Captain Friedman, a former lawyer known for his stringent adherence to regulations, would be expecting reports from the day's patrol. The building hummed with the subdued activity that characterized Jewish police operations, officially productive enough to satisfy German oversight, privately calibrated to do as little harm as possible. Mordecai passed the desk sergeant, nodded to fellow officers, and made his way to Captain Friedman's office. "Goldstein," Friedman acknowledged without looking up from his papers. "Anything to report?" "Minor altercation at the Mewa Street distribution point," Mordecai said, omitting his intervention with Daniel and Isaac. "Assisted an elderly man on Genzia Street. Otherwise, Sector 3 remains quiet." Friedman nodded, still not looking up. "You're reassigned for tomorrow. Report to the South Gate at 5 in the morning. A new transport of Jews from Radom is arriving. You'll assist with processing." Mordecai felt the familiar cold weight settle in his stomach. Processing meant separating the new arrivals, the able-bodied for labor, the young and elderly often for immediate deportation. It meant participating in the machinery of selection that determined who might live another month and who would die within days. "Captain," he began, then faltered, unsure what objection he could possibly raise that would not mark him as disloyal or, worse, sympathetic to the point of unreliability. Friedman finally looked up, his gaunt face set in lines of exhaustion. "It's not a request, Goldstein. The order comes directly from German administration. They specifically asked for officers who can maintain order without requiring German intervention." A pause. "That means they trust you to do their work without making them dirty their hands with it." "I understand," Mordecai said, the words ashen in his mouth. "Do you?" Friedman's voice lowered. "Because I sometimes wonder if any of us truly understand what we've become in this place. The Germans have created a masterpiece with us, Goldstein. They've made us instruments of our own destruction." The rare moment of candor surprised Mordecai. Captain Friedman normally maintained a rigid professionalism that discouraged such philosophical observations. "We do what we must to survive," Mordecai said, repeating what had become his mantra. "And when survival itself becomes a form of collaboration?" Friedman picked up a pen, signaling the end of the conversation. 5 o'clock, Southgate. Do not be late." Dismissed, Mordecai exited the headquarters into the deepening twilight. The ghetto transformed at night, its daytime misery settling into a different kind of darkness. Windows were shuttered against the cold, though thin ribbons of light escaped where boards did not perfectly meet. Occasional figures hurried along the streets, heads down, eager to be indoors before the 9 o'clock curfew, when even Jewish police were expected to be off the streets, unless specifically assigned to night duty. He turned toward his own quarters, a room in what had once been a luxury apartment, now subdivided to house 6 Jewish police officers. The position afforded him privacy that most ghetto residents lacked, another privilege that separated him from those he was supposed to police. As he walked, a figure stepped from the shadows of a doorway. Mordecai's hand moved to his truncheon before he recognized the face of Jacob Pinsky, once a colleague from his teaching days, now one of the ghetto's known resistance members. "Officer Goldstein," Pinsky said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery at the title. "May I have a moment of your official time?" Mordecai glanced around to ensure no other patrols were nearby. "Jacob, you should not be seen speaking to me. It isn't safe." "Nothing is safe," Pinsky replied, "but some risks are necessary. Walk with me." Against his better judgment, Mordecai fell into step beside his former colleague. They moved away from the main street into the labyrinth of passages that connected the ghetto's interior blocks. "I heard about what you did today," Pinsky said after they had walked in silence for several minutes. "With the Zimmerman boy and young Bromberg, splitting the bread 3 ways, playing Solomon." The fact that Pinsky knew of the incident within hours didn't surprise Mordecai. The resistance had eyes everywhere, information networks that rivaled those of the Judenrat. "It was nothing," Mordecai said. "A small decision." There are no small decisions anymore, Pinsky countered. Every choice we make either strengthens or weakens what humanity remains in this place. He stopped walking and turned to face Mordecai directly. Which is why I've come to ask you to make a larger choice. Mordecai tensed. If you're recruiting for the resistance... Not recruiting, Pinsky interrupted. Requesting specific assistance. You've been assigned to the processing of new arrivals tomorrow. The fact that the resistance already knew his reassignment was disturbing. How do you know that? Pinsky ignored the question. Among those arriving will be Joseph Kleinman and his family from Radom. Kleinman was a weapons manufacturer before the war. He has knowledge that would be valuable to our efforts, and his 17-year-old son David has already been working with resistance cells in Radom. What are you asking me to do? Mordecai asked, though he already knew. Ensure they are processed into the Ghetto rather than marked for deportation. Kleinman has papers identifying him as a metal worker, which should help. Just make sure German eyes are elsewhere during their processing. Mordecai exhaled slowly. Do you understand what you're asking? If I'm caught diverting people from deportation quotas, then you'll die, Pinsky said simply. As thousands already have, as thousands more will, the only choice any of us have is whether our deaths, when they come, will have meant something. The echo of Esther's question hung between them. If we survive this way, what will be left of us? I'll see what I can do, Mordecai said finally, but I make no promises. Pinsky nodded, accepting that this was the most commitment he would receive. The Kleinmans will be wearing blue scarves. The father has a scar across his right cheek. He turned to go, then paused. You were a good teacher, Mordecai. Your students respected you. Some of us still do. With that, he disappeared into the shadows between buildings, leaving Mordecai alone with the weight of what he had just agreed to attempt. The night passed in fitful sleep, broken by dreams of Esther, of students he had taught, of faces that had disappeared during the actions. By 4:30 in the morning, Mordecai was already dressed in his uniform, such as it was, the blue armband with Star of David, the cap that marked him as Ordnungsdienst, the truncheon at his belt. He drank a cup of ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, the closest thing to real coffee available in the ghetto for months, and headed toward the south gate in darkness. The processing area had been set up in a former warehouse adjacent to the gate. Long tables staffed by Jewish clerks working under German supervision would record names, ages, occupations, and a health status of new arrivals. Behind the tables stood a row of Jewish police officers, including Mordecai, there to maintain order during processing and to enforce the separations that would inevitably occur. SS Officer Heinrich Müller, known throughout the ghetto for his methodical cruelty, would oversee the entire operation. Unlike some Germans who seemed to take sadistic pleasure in their power, Müller approached his duties with the detachment of a bureaucrat. This made him more dangerous, not less. His decisions were never clouded by emotion, never subject to appeal through human connection. As dawn broke, the first trucks carrying Jews from Radom began to arrive. The deportees emerged blinking into the weak January sunlight, their faces bearing the same hollow-cheeked hunger that characterized the Warsaw ghetto residents. They carried small bundles of possessions, all that remained of lives once full and ordinary. Mordecai scanned the crowd for blue scarves, for a man with a scar across his right cheek. The first group passed through processing without incident, divided according to German priorities. Able-bodied men separated for labor assignments, families with young children, and the elderly flagged for resettlement. The euphemism everyone now understood meant transport to Treblinka. The second truck yielded more of the same. Mordecai performed his duties mechanically, directing people to the appropriate processing tables, maintaining the appearance of efficient German order. Inside, his mind raced, calculating opportunities, risks, potential moments when attention might be diverted. It was the third truck that brought the Kleinmans. Mordecai spotted them immediately. Father, mother, son, and a younger daughter, perhaps 12 years old, all wearing blue scarves despite the varied coats and clothes they wore. Joseph Kleinman's scar was prominent against his pale skin, a jagged line that suggested a wound improperly treated. They joined the processing line, Joseph keeping his family close together, his eyes constantly moving, assessing the situation with the alertness of someone already prepared for resistance. The son, David, had the same watchful quality, though he kept his gaze downward in the presence of Germans, a learned survival tactic. As the line inched forward, Mordecai positioned himself near the processing table, where the Kleinmans would eventually arrive. Officer Müller stood several tables away, currently focused on a dispute over a family's documentation. The German's attention was diverted. This might be the only opportunity. When the Kleinmans reached the table, Mordecai stepped forward as if checking their papers. "Metalworker?" he asked quietly, gesturing at Joseph's documentation. Joseph nodded almost imperceptibly. Mordecai turned to the Jewish clerk at the table. "This group goes to Sector 4 for skilled labor assignment," he said with authority. They're on the priority list from administration. The clerk hesitated, glancing at the paperwork. I don't see any notation about... It came directly from Captain Friedman this morning, Mordecai interrupted. Do you want me to call Officer Miller over to confirm? The threat worked. No one wanted to draw Miller's attention unnecessarily. The clerk nodded and processed the Kleinman family as directed, marking them for assignment to the ghetto's interior rather than for deportation. As they moved past him toward the ghetto entrance, David Kleinman's eyes met Mordecai's briefly. A flicker of understanding passed between them, not gratitude exactly, but recognition of a small victory against the machinery of destruction that surrounded them. The moment passed, the Kleinmans disappeared into the ghetto, and Mordecai returned to his duties. The rest of the processing continued without incident, though each family marked for resettlement weighed on him with crushing force. By mid-afternoon, the transport had been completely processed. 217 new residents admitted to the ghetto, 183 marked for deportation to Treblinka. As the operation concluded, Officer Miller approached Mordecai, his cold eyes assessing. Officer Goldstein, he said in accented Polish, you managed to maintain better order than most of your colleagues. Thank you. Herr Officer, Mordecai replied, eyes lowered appropriately. It has been noted in your file, Miller continued. Such efficiency is appreciated by the administration. The words were not a compliment, but a weight. Each German commendation was another link in the chain binding him to their system, another piece of evidence marking him as a collaborator in the eyes of his own people. I serve as required, Mordecai said, the safest possible response. Miller nodded, satisfied with the subservience, and moved away to supervise the departure of trucks now loaded with those selected for Treblinka. Mordecai watched them go, the faces pressed against the slats of the truck beds already seeming ghostly, as if they had departed from life the moment their names were marked for resettlement. Released from duty as the sun began to set, Mordecai made his way back through the ghetto streets toward his quarters. The day's events had left him drained beyond physical exhaustion, a soul weariness that no amount of rest could address. He had saved 4 lives by diverting the Kleinmans from deportation, but had participated in sending 183 others to their deaths. The mathematics of such moral accounting was beyond even his former skills as a teacher. As he turned onto his street, a small figure detached from a doorway and approached. It took him a moment to recognize Leah Mendel, the older of the orphaned children he had directed bread to the previous day. Officer, she said, her voice barely audible. The boy Isaac brought us bread yesterday. He said it came from you. Mordecai glanced around, uncomfortable with being seen in conversation with a child on the street. It was nothing, he said. You should be indoors before curfew. We have no indoors, Leah said simply. The family who took us in after our parents died was deported last week. We've been sleeping in the stairwell of Building 16. Another impossible situation. 2 children without parents or guardians, somehow surviving in the gaps of the ghetto's crumbling social fabric. In the world before, there would have been resources, organizations, extended family to care for orphaned children. In the ghetto, such children either found protection with other families or simply disappeared, into deportation transports, into the ranks of child smugglers who slipped through the walls to trade on the Aryan side, or into graves from starvation or disease. How old are you, Leah? He asked. 14, she answered. My brother Asher is 10. Too young to qualify for work assignments that might provide rations, too old to evoke the protection sometimes offered to very young children by families still capable of extending such care. Wait here, Mordecai said. He entered his building, went to his room, and returned with a small package wrapped in newspaper, his own bread ration for the next day, and a pair of woolen socks he had been saving. Take this, he said, pressing the package into her hands. I will speak to someone at the Jewish Welfare Office tomorrow about finding you proper lodging. Leah accepted the package with the solemn dignity that ghetto children had developed. Not the eager gratitude a child might have shown before the war, but the measured recognition that survival required accepting help where it was offered. Thank you, officer, she said. My brother says you're different from the others. Well, the observation, coming from a child, cut deeper than any adult judgment. Different how? He says you still see people when you look at us. The others just see problems to be managed. With that, she turned and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Mordecai standing alone on the street as curfew approached. He entered his building and climbed the stairs to his room, her words echoing. You still see people when you look at us? Was it true? Did he still see individuals rather than categories to be processed? Sometimes he feared the opposite, that the mechanisms of survival had reduced his vision to precisely the same dehumanizing calculations the Germans applied, just on a smaller scale. The choices he made daily involved determining who might benefit from small mercies, and who must be sacrificed to maintain his position, and the protection it offered to those he chose to help. His room, when he entered it, felt emptier than usual. Though small, it had always represented a kind of privilege in the crowded ghetto. Private space, a luxury almost no one else possessed. Tonight, it felt like isolation, a physical manifestation of the moral quarantine his position as Jewish police had created around him. He lit the small kerosene lamp that provided his only evening light. Electrical service in the ghetto was sporadic at best, and removed his uniform cap and armband. Without these symbols, he looked like any other ghetto resident, thin, tired, haunted by what he had seen and done. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Cautious, he replaced his armband before opening it. Jakob Pinsky stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" Mordecai hesitated, then stepped back, allowing his former colleague to enter. Once the door was closed, Pinsky spoke. "The Kleinmans arrived safely. They asked me to convey their gratitude." "It was a small thing," Mordecai said, the same words he had used to dismiss his intervention with the bread the previous day. "Not to them," Pinsky replied, "and not to us. Every life preserved matters, Mordecai, especially those with skills that can help us fight back." The implied inclusion, us, did not escape Mordecai's notice. "I'm not part of your resistance, Jacob. What I did today was a one-time favor that could have cost me my life." "And yet you did it," Pinsky observed, "which suggests you have not entirely surrendered to what they've made you become." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "This is for you. Read it when you're alone. Burn it afterward." "Oh," Mordecai accepted the paper without unfolding it. "What is it?" "An opportunity to do more than survive," Pinsky said. "An opportunity to remember who you were before all this." After Pinsky left, Mordecai unfolded the paper. It contained a hand-drawn map showing the location of a basement room in a building near the ghetto wall, a time, midnight, 3 days hence, and a brief message. The teacher must decide what lesson to impart to history. He stared at the paper for a long time, understanding what it represented. The resistance was offering him a chance to join them, to use his position as Jewish police to aid their efforts from within. It was an opportunity fraught with even greater danger than his current precarious existence. If discovered, he would face not just death, but torture to reveal others. Yet it also offered something his present life did not: purpose beyond mere survival, a chance to resist rather than merely endure, an opportunity to reclaim some shred of moral agency in a world designed to strip it away entirely. The lamp flickered as he held the paper over its flame, watching the map and message curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. The choice, however, remained before him, as stark and demanding as hunger itself. Morning arrived gray and bitter cold, the January day offering no reprieve from winter's grip on the ghetto. Mordecai rose before dawn, performed his meager ablutions with water that had frozen overnight in his wash basin, and dressed for patrol. His stomach growled with the now familiar pain of hunger, sharpened by having given his bread ration to Leah Mendel. His patrol route today took him through the central ghetto, past the Judenrat building, where administrative decisions affecting the entire ghetto population were made by the Jewish Council under German direction. The building stood as a symbol of the impossible position in which the ghetto leadership found itself, tasked with implementing German orders, while attempting to mitigate their worst effects, forever caught between collaboration and resistance. As he passed, the doors opened and Council Chairman Lichtenbaum emerged, flanked by 2 other council members. Lichtenbaum's face bore the haggard expression of one carrying impossible burdens. He had aged decades in the 3 years since the ghetto's creation, his once black hair now completely white, his tall frame bent as if physically compressed by responsibility. The chairman noticed Mordecai and paused. "Officer Goldstein," he called. "A moment, please." Mordecai approached, offering the deferential nod expected when addressing council leadership. "Chairman Lichtenbaum." "Walk with me," the chairman said, dismissing his colleagues with a gesture. They fell into step together, moving along the street where ghetto residents gave them a wide berth, this pairing of police and administrator representing the most visible Jewish implementation of German authority. "I understand you were at the South Gate processing yesterday," Lichtenbaum said after they had walked in silence for several minutes. Mordecai felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Yes, Chairman, I was assigned to maintain order during processing." "Officer Mueller spoke highly of your efficiency," Lichtenbaum continued, his tone revealing nothing of whether this was a concern or commendation. "He mentioned you specifically by name." "I merely performed my assigned duties," Mordecai said carefully. They turned onto a side street away from the main thoroughfare. Lichtenbaum stopped walking and turned to face Mordecai directly. "Tell me, Officer Goldstein, do you sleep at night?" The question, so unexpected and direct, caught Mordecai off guard. "Sir, do you sleep?" After days spent implementing their orders, facilitating their systems of control and deportation, do you find rest comes easily? It was a dangerous conversation, one that could be interpreted as seditious if overheard or reported. Yet Lichtenbaum's gaze held steady, demanding an honest response. No, Mordecai admitted quietly. I do not sleep well. Lichtenbaum nodded, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Neither do I, not for 3 years. He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. The council received new orders this morning. Another action is planned for next week. They are demanding 3,000 names for deportation. The number hung in the air between them, representing 3,000 lives to be extinguished, 3,000 individuals to be loaded onto trains bound for Treblinka. Why are you telling me this? Mordecai asked. Because you will be expected to help implement it, Lichtenbaum replied. Because I saw your name on the list of officers commended for efficiency. Because such commendations mark you as someone they believe will follow orders without question. He paused. And because I remember you from before, Professor Goldstein. I remember the man who organized evening classes for working adults who had never completed their education. I remember the mathematics teacher who believed in precision and accuracy, but also in humanity. Mordecai had no response to this unexpected invocation of his former self. We all make compromises to survive, Lichtenbaum continued. The question is whether we survive as ourselves or as something unrecognizable. He straightened his coat. That is all, officer. You may continue your patrol. The chairman walked away, leaving Mordecai standing alone with the knowledge of what was coming and the implicit question of what role he would play in it. 3,000 names, another action, more selections, more deportations, more deaths facilitated by Jewish hands acting under German orders. The rest of his patrol passed in a blur, his mind consumed by the chairman's revelation and the choice it presented. By the time he returned to his quarters that evening, a decision had crystallized, not suddenly, but as the culmination of accumulated moments of moral compromise and small resistances. He would attend the resistance meeting. He would find Jakob Pinsky and tell him about the planned action. He would use his position to warn as many as possible, to help some escape, to sabotage the German plans in whatever small ways he could without immediately exposing himself. It would not save everyone. It might not even save many. But it would mean choosing to act rather than merely being acted upon, choosing to resist rather than merely endure. It would mean reclaiming some fragment of the self he'd been before hunger and fear had whittled him down to survival calculations. 3 days later, at midnight, Mordecai stood before the basement door, indicated on Pinsky's map. He had come without his uniform, wearing only the civilian clothes that marked him as just another ghetto resident. He knocked in the pattern specified. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 more. The door opened to reveal Jakob Pinsky and 5 others gathered around a table lit by a single candle. Among them was David Kleinman, the 17-year-old son Mordecai had helped divert from deportation. You came, Pinsky said, surprise evident in his voice. I came, Mordecai agreed. I have information about a planned action next week. 3,000 people are to be deported. He looked around at the gathered faces, illuminated by flickering candlelight. I want to help warn them. I want to help as many as possible escape the selection. David Kleinman stepped forward, his young face solemn in the dim light. Welcome to the resistance, Teacher Goldstein. We have much work to do. In that moment, in that basement room lit by a single candle against the darkness of the ghetto night, Mordecai Goldstein ceased to be merely a Jewish policeman walking the tightrope of survival. He became something else, a man who had chosen to fight back against the machinery of destruction, even knowing the fight was likely futile. A man who had decided that how one lived and how one died mattered as much as survival itself. The hunger that walked the streets of Warsaw Ghetto had not diminished. It would continue its relentless companionship through the cold winter and beyond, but it would no longer be the only force guiding Mordecai's choices. Alongside it now walked resistance, small, perhaps doomed, but undeniably human in its defiance of the inhuman system that surrounded them. Outside, snow began to fall again on the ghetto streets, covering the day's footprints in a blank white canvas. By morning, new tracks would be made, new paths chosen, new stories written in the brief impressions left before being covered again by the relentless progression of history. But tonight, in a candlelit basement, a mathematics teacher who had become a Jewish policeman chose to become something else entirely, a point of resistance in the careful calculations of survival. In the weeks that followed, Mordecai lived a dangerous double existence. By day, he continued his duties as a Jewish policeman, patrolling the ghetto streets with his blue armband and wooden truncheon, maintaining the appearance of German order. By night, he passed information to the resistance. Patrol schedules, planned raids, names of those marked for deportation. The planned action proceeded as Chairman Lichtenbaum had warned, but with a difference. Hundreds of those who would have been taken had disappeared into hiding places throughout the ghetto. False walls constructed in apartments, Concealed basement rooms, attic spaces made accessible through hidden trapdoors. The German quotas remained unfilled, causing fury among the SS officers overseeing the operation. They knew, Officer Miller had said during a meeting with the Jewish police leadership. Someone warned them. His cold eyes had swept across the gathered officers, including Mordecai. When we discover who leaked this information, the consequences will be severe. Despite the risk, Mordecai found that his nights were now visited less frequently by the ghosts of those he had failed to save and more often by the faces of those he had helped. The Kleinman family had become central to the resistance cell he had joined. Joseph Kleinman's pre-war knowledge of metallurgy had been turned toward creating improvised weapons, crude but functional firearms assembled from scavenged parts. David Kleinman, with the adaptability of youth, had become one of the most effective couriers, moving between resistance cells with messages and supplies. Rebecca Zimmerman, the mother of Daniel, whom Mordecai had found injured in the alley months ago, had joined their efforts as well. Her apartment, positioned near one of the ghetto's main intersections, had become an observation post from which German movements were monitored and recorded. Even young Leah Mendel had found purpose in their resistance. At 14, she could move through the ghetto with less suspicion than adults, carrying messages folded into the seams of her tattered coat. Her brother Asher, too young for more dangerous work, served as a lookout, his high-pitched whistle warning of approaching patrols. It was Leah who brought the news that would change everything. Teacher Goldstein, she said, using the title the resistance members had adopted for him rather than officer. She had found him during his patrol, approaching with the careful nonchalance Ghetto children had perfected. My friend Sarah overheard Germans talking at the gate. They're planning something big, not just another action. They used a different word. What word, Leah? Mordecai asked quietly, pretending to check her papers as they spoke. Liquidation, she said. They talked about complete liquidation beginning next month, April. The word settled in Mordecai's stomach like lead. Liquidation could mean only one thing, the end of the ghetto itself, the final deportation of all remaining Jews from Warsaw to the death camps. That night, the resistance cell gathered in their basement meeting place. The room was more crowded than usual. Representatives from other cells had come, as similar rumors had reached them through various channels. The information is consistent from multiple sources, Jacob Pinsky confirmed after everyone had reported what they had heard. The Germans are planning to liquidate the entire ghetto, beginning April 19th. How many of us remain? Someone asked. How many Jews in Warsaw? Approximately 55,000, Joseph Kleinman answered. He had been maintaining careful population counts based on information gathered from Jewish police records that Mordecai provided, down from over 400,000 before the deportations began. The number hung in the air. 55,000 people facing final liquidation. What can we possibly do against their plans? A woman asked, her voice tight with controlled fear. We have no real weapons, no army. We fight, David Kleinman said simply. Though only 17, his voice carried the authority of absolute conviction. We do not go quietly to Treblinka as the others were taken. We make them pay in blood for every Jewish life they take. Murmurs ran through the gathered resistance members, some of agreement, others of doubt. Armed resistance against the German military seemed like suicide, yet the alternative, passive acceptance of final liquidation, seemed equally unthinkable. Even if we fight, Mordecai said, we cannot win, not in any traditional sense. The Germans have tanks, artillery-trained soldiers. We have improvised weapons and untrained civilians. We do not fight to win, Pinsky responded. We fight to choose our deaths rather than having them chosen for us. We fight so that history will record that the Jews of Warsaw did not go meekly to slaughter. We fight because resistance itself has meaning, even when victory is impossible. The discussion continued late into the night. Plans were made, tasks assigned, preparations begun for what would come to be known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Weapons would be gathered, smuggled in from the outside when possible, manufactured inside the ghetto when necessary. Fighting groups would be organized, training conducted in secret, hiding places and bunkers prepared for non-combatants. Through it all, Mordecai found himself assigned a critical role, using his position as Jewish police to gather intelligence, to misdirect German attention, to help smuggle weapons past checkpoints by creating diversions when needed. You are our eyes inside their system, Pinsky told him. Without you, we fight blind. The weight of this responsibility settled onto Mordecai's already burdened shoulders. He thought of Esther, dead of typhus, in her grave these many months. What would she think of him now? The man who had once justified joining the Jewish police as a means of survival had now committed himself to a path that almost certainly led to death. But death with purpose, death with meaning, death chosen rather than merely accepted. As February turned to March, preparations intensified. The Germans seemed to sense something had changed within the ghetto. Patrols increased. Inspections became more frequent and thorough. Jewish police were scrutinized more carefully, their loyalties questioned, their actions monitored. Captain Friedman called Mordecai into his office one gray afternoon in mid-March. "Officer Goldstein," he said without preamble, "you've been observed conversing with ghetto residents outside your official duties. Specifically, children in Sector 3, near the Noah Lippi Street area." Mordecai's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I've been monitoring orphaned children, Captain, directing them to welfare services when possible." Friedman studied him with weary eyes that revealed nothing of whether he accepted this explanation. "The Germans are increasingly suspicious of the Jewish police, Goldstein. They believe some among us may have divided loyalties. My loyalty is to maintaining order and ensuring survival, as it has always been," Mordecai said, the practiced lie coming easily after months of deception. "Is it?" Friedman opened a drawer and removed a small blue cloth, a scrap of fabric identical to the blue scarves the Kleinman family had worn months ago during the processing of Radom Jews. "This was found in your quarters during an inspection yesterday. Can you explain it?" Mordecai had not known his room had been searched. The realization that his private space had been violated, that eyes had examined his few possessions looking for evidence of disloyalty, sent a chill through him. "It belonged to my wife," he said, inventing quickly, "before she died. I keep it as a remembrance." Friedman placed the fabric on his desk between them. "The Germans have informants everywhere, Goldstein. In the ghetto, in the police, even in the resistance they know exists, but cannot quite locate. They believe there will be some kind of organized opposition to the final liquidation. They are preparing accordingly." The conversation was circling something unspoken, something dangerous. Was Friedman warning him, threatening him, testing his reaction to see if he would reveal something? "I've heard nothing of any resistance," Mordecai said. "No?" Friedman leaned forward. "Then let me speak plainly, because we have little time. I know about your meetings. I know about your connection to the Kleinmans. I know about the weapons being gathered." Mordecai's hand moved instinctively toward his truncheon, the only weapon he carried. If Friedman was an informant, if he had evidence of Mordecai's resistance activities, then his life was already forfeit. Friedman noticed the movement and shook his head. "I am not your enemy, Goldstein. If I wanted you arrested, German soldiers would have taken you days ago." He sighed heavily. "I asked you once if you understood what we had become in this place. Instruments of our own destruction. I have been such an instrument for too long." Understanding dawned slowly. "You want to help the resistance?" Mordecai said, still wary, still uncertain if this was an elaborate trap. "I want to die as a Jew rather than as a tool of those who would exterminate us," Friedman corrected. "The distinction matters to me, even if to no one else." He pushed a folded paper across the desk. "These are the patrol schedules for the week before the planned liquidation begins. The Germans have shared them with me to coordinate Jewish police assignments. They may be useful to your colleagues." Mordecai took the paper without unfolding it. "Why now? After all this time implementing their orders, why choose resistance now when it cannot possibly succeed?" Friedman's gaze was steady. "For the same reason you did, I imagine. Because there comes a point when survival at any cost is no longer survival worth having." He gestured toward the door. "Go. We will not speak of this again. If questioned, I will deny this conversation ever took place." Mordecai left the police headquarters with the patrol schedules hidden inside his coat and a new ally in a place he had least expected one. The resistance was growing, not just in numbers, but in resolve. Jews from every background, former businessmen, teachers, rabbis, workers, even Jewish police, were choosing to stand together for one final act of defiance. As March drew to a close and April approached with the promise of spring that would never come for most of them, Mordecai found himself thinking more often of what his life had been before. The classroom where he had taught mathematics, the students who had struggled and succeeded under his guidance, the simple apartment he had shared with Esther, the Friday evening meals with candles and prayers. One evening, as he sat in his room reviewing building plans that detailed possible fighting positions and escape routes, a gentle knock came at his door. Opening it, he found Leah Mendel standing there, something clutched in her small hand. "Teacher," she said quietly, "I found something today while carrying messages near the old school building. I thought you should have it." She extended her hand, revealing a battered fountain pen, its metal clip bent but still recognizable. Mordecai took it, turning it over in his fingers. The pen was identical to those he had used to grade papers before the war, with different colored inks for different types of corrections. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In the rubble near where the gymnasium stood," Leah said. "I remembered you telling us about your collection of pens, how your wife teased you about the ink stains on your fingers." He had mentioned this only once, during a late-night planning session when exhaustion had loosened his tongue and led to reminiscences of the world before. He had not expected anyone to remember such a small detail of his former life. "Thank you, Leah," he said, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. This means more than you know. She smiled, a rare, genuine smile untainted by the ever-present ghetto cynicism. We all need something to remind us who we were, who we still are beneath everything they've done to us. After she left, Mordecai sat holding the pen, rolling it between his fingers, as he had done countless times while contemplating a particularly difficult mathematical problem, or considering how to explain a complex concept to struggling students. The pen represented continuity, a thread connecting his former self to whatever he had become in the crucible of the ghetto. He placed it carefully in his pocket. When the fighting began, and it would begin soon, he would carry it with him. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what they were truly fighting for. Not just to oppose the Germans or to choose the manner of their deaths, but to assert that they remained human beings with histories, with identities, with dignity that could not be stripped away even by the most systematic dehumanization. 2 nights later, the resistance leadership gathered for what they knew might be their final planning meeting before the German liquidation began. Reports had confirmed that SS reinforcements had arrived in Warsaw, that tanks and heavy weapons were being positioned around the ghetto perimeter, that the final operation would commence within days. Jakubinski stood before the gathered fighters, his thin face solemn in the candlelight. The time for preparation is ending. The time for action approaches. Each of you knows your assignment, your position, your role when the Germans enter the ghetto for the final liquidation. He looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. We fight not just for ourselves, but for the dignity of our people everywhere. We fight to ensure that history records that in Warsaw, Jews chose resistance over submission, even knowing the outcome was predetermined. Joseph Kleinman spoke next, detailing the weapons that had been gathered. Pistols smuggled in piece by piece and reassembled, homemade grenades constructed from scavenged materials, Molotov cocktails prepared in hidden workshops, even a few rifles acquired through the Polish underground at enormous cost. We are few against many, he acknowledged. Our weapons are limited against their arsenal, but we will make every bullet count, every grenade matter, every fighter significant. David Kleinman, now 18 and a commander of one of the fighting groups despite his youth, described the defensive positions that had been prepared throughout the ghetto: fortified buildings, rooftop sniper positions, underground bunkers connected by passages unknown to the Germans. We will not fight as they expect, he said, his young voice steady with conviction. Not in open confrontation where their superior numbers and weapons would overwhelm us immediately. We will fight from shadows, from hidden places, appearing to strike and then disappearing before they can respond in force. Throughout the presentations, Mordecai sat quietly, absorbing the details, committing maps and plans to memory. His role when the fighting began would be crucial, using his knowledge of police and German patrol patterns to help coordinate attacks, to warn of approaching dangers, to guide fighters through the complex network of ghetto alleys and passages. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca Zimmerman approached him. Her son Daniel, recovered from the attack months ago that had first brought him into Mordecai's moral calculations, stood beside her. The boy, no young man now, had grown taller despite the persistent hunger of ghetto life, his face showing the first hints of adulthood. Officer Goldstein, Rebecca said, using his official title, though they were among resistance members who typically avoided such designations, Daniel has something he wishes to ask you. Daniel stepped forward, his expression serious. I have been assigned to Commander Kleinman's fighting group, he said, but I request reassignment to your unit instead. Mordecai was surprised. David Kleinman's unit would see direct combat, opportunities for the kind of heroic resistance that appealed to young men. Mordecai's role was more strategic, less likely to yield moments of glory, though no less dangerous. Why would you want that, Daniel? Because of what you did that day in the alley with Isaac and the bread, Daniel answered. You found a way to be, just when justice seemed impossible. That is the kind of resistance I wish to be part of. Mordecai glanced at Rebecca, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She was entrusting her son to his guidance, a responsibility perhaps greater than any he had yet assumed in the resistance. Very well, he said. But understand, my work may seem less direct than firing a rifle at German soldiers, but it is no less dangerous. Perhaps more so, as it requires moving throughout the ghetto during active combat. I understand, Daniel said. I choose it anyway. As the resistance members departed, returning to their various hiding places and preparations, Mordecai remained behind with Jakubinski. They stood in silence for several moments, 2 former educators now transformed into resistance leaders by circumstances neither could have imagined in their previous lives. Do you think any of us will survive this, Jakob? Mordecai finally asked. Some may, Pinsky replied. Those in the deepest bunkers, perhaps. Those who find ways out through sewers or hidden passages. But survival is not our primary objective now. What is, then? To write our own ending to this story, Pinsky said. The Germans have scripted everything since the beginning. The creation of the ghetto, the starvation, the deportations, the killing. For once, we will be the authors of what happens. Even if the final page is the same, the chapters leading to it will be ours to write. The metaphor was fitting for a former literature professor turned resistance fighter. Mordecai nodded, understanding. Then let us write something history will remember. It already has been written, Pinsky said. In 1,000 small choices, the bread you divided 3 ways, the Kleinman family you saved from deportation, the children you've protected. The uprising to come is just the culmination of a resistance that has been ongoing in countless unrecorded acts of moral courage. As April 19th approached, the data intelligence indicated the final liquidation would begin. A strange calm settled over the ghetto. On the surface, life continued in its constrained patterns. People lined up for bread rations, conducted what limited business remained possible, observed religious practices in hidden corners. But beneath this veneer of routine, every adult now knew what was coming. They moved with purpose, with resolve, with the dignity of those who had made their choices and would not be undone by fear. Mordecai continued his police duties, maintaining his cover until the moment fighting began. He walked his patrols, filed his reports, attended briefings where German officers outlined the resettlement operation scheduled to begin, their euphemism for the final destruction of the ghetto and its inhabitants. On the night of April 18th, he stood at his window looking out over the darkened buildings. Curfew had emptied the streets, but he knew that behind blacked-out windows, in basements and attics, in hidden bunkers and concealed rooms, the fighters were making final preparations. Weapons were being distributed, positions assigned. Children and the elderly moved to the deepest shelters. He touched the fountain pen in his pocket, thinking of Esther, of his students from before, of all that had been lost and all that remained worth fighting for. Then he removed his police armband and cap and placed them on the table. He would not wear them again. When morning came, when the Germans entered the ghetto and forced to begin the liquidation, Mordecai Goldstein would no longer be a Jewish policeman maintaining order under German authority. He would be a resistance fighter, a teacher who had found his final lesson to impart, that even in the darkest moments of history, human dignity could assert itself against overwhelming force, that moral choice remained possible even when all other freedoms had been stripped away, that resistance itself had meaning even when victory was impossible. As dawn approached on April 19th, 1943, Mordecai left his room for the last time and made his way through the silent ghetto streets to the position where he would meet Daniel Zimmerman and the others assigned to his unit. The first gray light revealed a ghetto transformed, not physically, for the same crumbling buildings and narrow streets remained, but spiritually. The fear that had been the ghetto's constant companion had not disappeared, but alongside it now stood something stronger, resolve. The Warsaw Ghetto was about to speak its final word in a language the Germans had not expected and would never forget, the language of resistance. And Mordecai Goldstein, once a mathematics teacher who had taught the precise science of numbers, had found his place in this last, most important lesson. Not as a policeman walking the moral tightrope of survival, but as a fighter who had chosen to die on his feet rather than live on his knees. History would record what happened next, how Jewish fighters armed with pistols, homemade bombs, and desperate courage held off the German army for nearly a month, how bunkers and hidden passages became the stage for a resistance that shocked the Nazi leadership. How, in the end, the Germans had to destroy the ghetto building by building, unable to break the spirit of resistance, even as they overwhelmed its physical manifestations. But in those last moments before the fighting began, as Mordecai took his position and waited for the sound of German troops entering the ghetto, his thoughts were not on how history would remember these events. They were on the present moment, on the choice he and others had made to transform themselves from victims into resistors, from objects of history into its subjects. The hunger that had walked the streets of Warsaw Ghetto remained. It would claim many lives in the fighting to come, but it no longer walked alone. Alongside it now marched courage, dignity, and the unbreakable human spirit that even the most systematic dehumanization had failed to extinguish.